Good morning, BookTube. It's ML Clark, and we are back with our special guest, The Highway, as ever. So apologies in advance, unless you are someone who thoroughly enjoys the sound of a tooting truck or a roaring motorcycle, or considering that it's Sunday, you might even get the beautiful vocal stylings of a funeral procession, which are not exactly somber affairs here in the same way. You sometimes get music blasting, people cheering while they're popped outside of their cars, figure eights on the highway. It's interesting, I'll give you that. Long story short, we are back, and it has been an interesting process. These 3 weeks have involved a little bit of adjustment because I relaunched my newsletter with a 4-day posting schedule after Only Sky became defunct. And I have been trying to integrate a lot of the kind of work that I was doing for Only Sky with the newsletter, which means a lot of research goes into many of those pieces. And then for some reason, despite all of that research, I had kind of thought that I could just leap into a BookTube recording on Friday morning to have something for my patrons via Patreon right away. But the BookTube also requires prep work, so that's what I've learned. And now that I fully understand, I can't go from a thorough deep dive on Thursday for the newsletter to being fully prepped for an early morning BookTube recording on Friday. I've accepted this. We're changing workflow, so it goes. The first week of the relaunched BookTube focused on introducing a little bit about the culture around speculative fiction right now, and that's definitely the overarching framing device I want to use for this channel. While I am doing a lot of other work on the newsletter, Patreon and the BookTube are going to be talking about elements of science fiction and fantasy as an industry and as a culture. So the first week we did a magazine review, and we're going to keep doing that once a month. I think it's good to have a grounding in the actual fiction. And I hope that by looking at every month's Clark's World stories, you'll be able to pick up on some overarching trends and reflect a little bit better on the way that stylistic changes are manifesting in our culture and our industry all the time. Last week, I talked about the differences between indie publishing and trad publishing with a focus on the challenges for both. I did a review of an indie published work in relation to this because the work in question is well written and also something that I don't think would ever be picked up by a traditional publisher. So we talked about the reasons for that and the kind of schism that this can create in our genre. But today I wanted to talk about something else that required a lot of research. It required me to do a lot of prep work, just like reading a book for the last one and doing a full magazine read for the one before. I want to talk more about our fan culture. And we're going to come back to this in many ways, so I'm really just framing this part of the conversation, which will emerge in many other booktubes in the future. We're going to look at 2 podcasts today. We're going to look at these podcasts on 2 different sides of the spectrum, not in terms of quality. They will appeal, I think, to different audiences. Before we get into that, though, I do want to talk a little bit about the history of how our culture has framed science fiction and fantasy, and it comes, where do we get our authority to talk about what's happening in science fiction and fantasy? Before the digital era, this was done in a few spaces. One was convention halls, obviously. If you were the kind of person who would go to a convention, that would be where a lot of dynamic conversation would be taking place in panels and in just meet and greets with other people. Now, I've never been one for conventions, partially financially. I've never had the time or finances for them in the past. On top of that, I'm not somebody, there are many fans who really love meeting authors. I have never been somebody who's been really excited or starstruck, like I need to meet this person. In part because for me, I get really nervous about the platform we put people on. I think it does something strange to us. I know obviously I'm a writer, I publish, I do have a platform, but I think that it can create very strange expectations, and it can change both the way that the platformed person and the audience configure themselves and think about other people. Oftentimes there's a gloss that we put on people in higher spaces, that then leads to shock when it turns out that they are human and as flawed as the rest of us. It's a delicate push and pull. I'm not a keen on celebrity culture, but others are, and that's great. If that works for you, the conventions are a great place to get a sense of the genre. I am among the group of people who have always enjoyed reading the essays in front of an anthology. So the people who curate anthologies in the past would often do an introductory essay to explain the state of the genre or some key component related to why they chose to curate what they did in the collection. And before the digital era, these were crucial places for people to learn about what's going on in the industry. Another place was inside a lot of print publications, the review section. So good. It's often very spicy in past periods, where you'd get a sense of the work that's being published and also the context into which it fits. Wonderful. Reviews continue today, but often they aren't as well celebrated. And there's a complex cultural shift behind that. What's considered the old school world, the pre-digital era, is sometimes considered a highly gate-kept era. And the problem with that is every era is gate-kept. And oftentimes the digital universe can give us the impression that it's not. It feels like it's an open commons, but it's not. You have cliques, you have geopolitical networks, you have people who know each other because they went to the same workshop and have friends with the same editor or agent, and so they get published. And it's always been that way. It always will be, no matter how big and open the internet sometimes seems. But it did something very strange to our notion of critical review culture. So we had all of these reviewers and these curators and these anthologists, and they carefully framed a lot of their opinions and sort of set standards and tastes for a while. And in the new economy, pretty much anybody who comes online, if they can affect the aesthetic, the voice, the charisma, the sort of authoritative tone, then they can very quickly also be seen as an expert, which is fair enough to some extent. But I think it does a disservice to another really important and in the past really cherished part of the industry, which is general fandom of average readers, where you don't need to perform being a critic on the same level. You don't need to establish yourself as an authority to have an opinion. I feel as though our digital space, with this very strange blend of professional and at the same time friendly, open, social network, has caused this conflation of terms, or this conflation of what one is doing when one talks about a work. And suddenly everything you do is professionalized. What happens to just the everyday readers? What happens to people who just want to share love for a piece? It's difficult. So we have this messy confluence of some very formalized, very careful forms of critique alongside people who affect the aesthetic of authority, and a huge body of people who probably just really want to enjoy the work and talk about how much they enjoy it on other terms. I've chosen 2 podcasts today that I think reflect that range really well. The first one that we're going to talk about is actually second on the list. I don't know why. I think I put them in, for anyone who can see my YouTube, I have the order a little bit mixed, but I think it had to do with the color coding. I think it was just a little odd the other way. The Coode Street Podcast is led by 2 people, Gary K. Wolfe and Jonathan Stratton. Gary K. Wolfe has been a reviewer in our genre since I think 1991. So he's got a storied career, which means very clear sense of his viewpoint, his lens when he writes about anything. He's also a very generous reviewer. Some reviewers do not take care to choose work that they are looking forward to or that they think they're going to find some value in. And so many reviewers will focus on a wide range of work, sometimes to critique it. But Wolfe is very good at writing pieces, first and foremost, based on work that he's interested in. And that doesn't automatically mean he's going to like it. And at the same time, he focuses on a very generous approach to the work to really contextualize it. Where does it fit in? How does this reflect a particular moment, what kinds of historical precedents exist, what is it working in dialogue with. So good overview of the work itself, and you'd also get a sense of where it belongs. Quite nice. Jonathan Strahan is a career anthologist and editor, and as a result has absolutely contributed to the conversation about the state of the genre, and has worked with Tor.com, which I think now is identifying itself as Reactor, but the two of them have very stable, very institutional approaches to the work. Wolf writes significantly for Locus magazine, which I will write about. I think we'll do a piece on Locus and maybe a piece on Tor in the future. Locus magazine has a really wonderful end-of-year list, which I thoroughly enjoy because it is quite extensive, and not just within a few narrow categories, but it also has many categories of material. And so I look forward to, for instance, its best of nonfiction, and you don't usually see that kind of work celebrated elsewhere. So Locus magazine and Tor, Reactor are some really stable, strong aspects of the institutional framework of science fiction and fantasy, and these two gentlemen have spent their careers moving through a lot of those frameworks. And what they bring to their podcast is a fairly direct conversation. You're not going to get too much banter or distraction in it. They will reflect on a book or a genre trend, overarching notions about what's happening in the genre slightly more broadly on certain occasions. They'll have author interviews, which can be quite thorough, not mere everyday chat. They'll go into a lot of the themes and a lot of the context and a lot of the background. And when they publish pretty much anything, there's always a meta component. And so there's one piece I'd like to highlight. I think it's their second last episode. They just posted something about cozy as a genre and why the cozy is having its moment. And I've only listened to half of it thus far. It just dropped, I think, last night. But that one is lovely as well because it's generous even with a phenomenon that might not necessarily be their cup of tea. And that's wonderful to be able to get that kind of lens. The one prior to it is quite a good, I think, example of how they go about their work, though. That one is about the listicle. It's about the question of what is served by having articles that are framed around the idea of 5 books you must read before you die, or 5 of the top time travel works in science fiction history. So they look at the framework and they acknowledge their own culpability. One of them had recently published a listicle because, writers got to get paid, but they can still be skeptical of the phenomenon with generosity. And that's really, I think, what makes their podcast stand out, is that when they are approaching something that they might have skepticism about, they might look at the listicle, for instance, as something that gives you one kind of information but is pointedly absent in another key form of discourse about the genre. They're still acknowledging that there might be a need or a reason for an article that doesn't necessarily serve all ends. So when they look at the listicle, they notice the commercial components, how oftentimes the work is very much skewed toward more recent publications. And when they reflect on what's missing, they talk about the idea that the labels that are used as a shorthand in these publications tend not to actually be analyzed. What is being talked about when we say what is time travel, or what are we determining as the best works, for instance? There's no evaluation of those parameters. So I'm not going to go into the whole episode, but I want to highlight that this is the kind of work, the sophisticated analysis of how certain phenomena, whether it's a specific work or a particular subgenre or a kind of just moment in the genre in general, is working with everything else that's going on in science fiction and fantasy. So you'll get some rich conversations, be introduced to a lot of lovely work, and you'll come away definitely with food for thought about the overall climate, which is nice. On the other side of the spectrum, I have listed Podside Picnic. And Podside Picnic is a group of gentlefolk who pop open a cold one and shoot the shit about a work of the fantastic, something from the realm of the fantastical. It can be a movie, sometimes it's anime, sometimes it's a book, recent book especially, that might have gained certain acclaim and might be talked about in the moment. It might be a short story. It might be a short story from the past, something that was foundational in terms of setting a certain subgenre down on its path. Recently there have been some pieces on Arthur Machen, for instance, that are quite interesting. Now, I will warn people that this podcast does have a lot more banter. It can have a lot more digressions. It really feels like a conversation between some fellows who have popped open a cold one and sat down, having read or watched a particular media item, and they just talk about it, and they talk about the impressions that it brings to mind, the ways in which it intersects with their own experiences with other literature. Some of them have a little more history about the work or a little bit more context, and other ones might be fairly new to those elements. So there's a little bit of an education that goes on in the course of it when one person is teaching the others. The podcast picnic is identified as Carlo, Kurt, Chris, and Pete, but they're not always all there. Different combinations will emerge, which means different kinds of conversations will emerge as well. And sometimes they have special guests, and sometimes they have a very narrow focus. Actually, one of the pieces that I most enjoyed recently, I don't necessarily listen to every single episode, but when there's a good classic, or when there's a piece that definitely has resonance in terms of a conversation, it's nice to hear the lads just shooting the shit about it. There was this recent episode actually about Legends and Lattes, and Legends and Lattes is cozy fantasy and the site of so much discourse. A lot of people definitely felt that it was lacking in some political dimensions, it's a very funny insular world that we have. Science fiction and fantasy is often accused right now, we're having a woke moment, there's too much wokeness going on, but then within it there's this bubble of cozy core and gentle storytelling by the very people that other people consider to be too woke. So it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I didn't particularly like the politics of this book, even though it is a fairly easy read, I guess. But what I really loved about the conversation, which in this case was only between two, was that it was extremely generous as well. And it was about, for them, a book that they found to be, it's fine, in the sense of it's not necessarily worth all of the outrage and outcry that was associated with it. Although, again, in our genre, that tends to come down to artificiality. The book itself would never have been under such scrutiny if it hadn't been nominated for a major award. That suddenly launches an innocuous work that has its audience, that has its outreach, into a place of just absolute scathing attack by many different elements. These are the tempest in teapots that I often discuss in our genre, and part of the reason I don't enjoy the award circuits in general, and I'm not really interested in the kind of celebrity culture, because oftentimes work is elevated just to be torn down. My point with this episode is that it's a really good, generous example of the way that these two folks, who weren't fully enamored with the story, 100% know how to reflect on it, and reflect on it as readers, thinking about strengths, weaknesses, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, in an open, wonderful way that really does allow people to form their own opinions, and at the same time to maybe rethink initial premises. There are lots of other really great episodes though, which is why I also placed a photo in today's Image for Better Worlds Theory of a series that I was introduced to through the podcast. And that's one of the other fun parts of some of these reader response podcasts, is that they will introduce you to something that you might have overlooked. And I had overlooked Scavenger's Reign because it just dropped last year on HBO at the end of the year with very little promotion. And if it weren't for these kinds of podcasts, they might just slip one's notice entirely. And I will be talking more about Scavenger's Reign in another time and place, but I wanted to put it up here to celebrate the fact that these kinds of reader-oriented podcasts, they might be banter-driven, and they might essentially just be a few folks sitting together to chat about a work together, but they do also serve to pique interest and to call attention to many things that might have been overlooked or maybe just deserve a second look. So these two podcasts, I think, represent a good range. We'll talk about other fan works going forward, but I wanted to just introduce the importance of this kind of conversation happening. In the past, we had a lot more driven by conversation driven by conventions and by the essays at the beginning of anthologies and by the reviews in the publications that you might have a subscription to. The digital landscape has opened things up, and yet the push to professionalize, I think, has created too narrow an understanding of what response can do. So on one side, Coode Street Podcast, these are two storied, seasoned reviewers and curators of science fiction content, and they have wonderful meta discussions about the role of certain works or genres within the broader industry, as well as specific industry moments and questions about format. On the other side, we have Podside Picnic, which is just a few lads who like a few brews and a few good books and movies and anime and short stories and history, and we'll just shoot the shit together in a way that opens up the work and reminds us why we enjoy science fiction and fantasy in the first place. Not always to professionalize, not always to sell a product, just to enjoy something and to share in a conversation with others. So I just wanted to call your attention today to that range in fan culture. We will come back to these concepts in the future. I think probably one more piece before we cycle back to another Clark's World review, so there'll be an opportunity again to think about how wide-ranging science fiction and fantasy is. But whatever corner you occupy in it, celebrate it, honor it. It doesn't all need to be this rush to publish or to make your way onto awards lists. There's a lot of wonderful work happening in the margins, curated by a lot of folks who maybe won't get celebrated the same way come award season. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your patience as always with my special guest, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.